I still have the two halves of that slip. I keep them in a small flat tin, the kind you use for sewing needles, tucked in the upper left pocket of whatever field jacket I happen to own that season. The paper has gone soft at the folds now, a little translucent from years of body heat. The edges of the tear darken slightly where my fingers have rested against them, but the glyph is still clear. Kensha, 6 Orrathi strokes pressed into the waxy surface by a first thermostat smelled, I was told later, of resin and machine oil. I was told later, because at the time I couldn't smell anything. Fear does that to you. It switches off the parts of the body that aren't essential and routes everything to your eyes, your ears, your legs. I was 22 years old, and my stepfather had sold me to pay off a syndicate debt. I want to be careful about how I say that, because I have noticed over the years that people hear it and immediately go somewhere theatrical. They imagine chains or a ship hold, branding iron. The Orrathi weren't that kind of operation. They were efficient and administrative. They had forms. They had a classification system that had been running for 600 years with almost no alteration. Because it worked, and because no one who had been classified under it had ever successfully contested a filing, they were not cruel in the way that word usually implies. They didn't enjoy what they did. They simply didn't consider it a moral category at all. You either had standing in their commercial ledger, or you did not. If you did not, you were goods. If you were goods, you were classified. If you were classified, you had a slip. It was all very orderly. That orderliness was, in its own way, harder to hold in your mind than cruelty would have been. Cruelty implies a choice, and choices imply the possibility of a different choice. The Orrathi intake workers who moved through the yard at Varkeshet were not making choices. They were following a procedure. They had been following it, or their predecessors had been following it, for 6 centuries, and the procedure had never been interrupted, because the procedure had never needed to be. There had never been a reason. There had always, till that particular Tuesday, been no reason at all. The moon of Orrathi is not a comfortable place in the middle of its rotation cycle. Primary, a yellow-white star called Fairflothsal, on Federation charts and nothing at all on Orrathi ones, because the Orrathi don't name what they don't own. Sits almost directly overhead at local noon, and the light it throws down on Varkeshet's pale stone streets is the kind of light that seems to have weight to it. Not heat, exactly, the temperature is survivable, but a brightness that presses against you, fills in the shadows and leaves nowhere to look that isn't bright. You find yourself squinting not from pain, but from the constant low-grade effort of it, your eyes working harder than they should have to, just to define the edges of things. The city is built wide and low, almost no vertical structures. The Orrathi aesthetic, such as it is, favors spread over height, the way a market stall favors width over depth. You want as much surface area exposed to buyers as possible. The streets are broad enough to move cargo through, the buildings single-story or at most 2, their facades in that same pale stone that reads almost white in the noon light. The Orrathi cast-mark glyphs carved into lintels and gate posts at intervals that I would later learn indicated the commercial classification of the premises behind them. A city of signs, all of them in a language I couldn't read. Processing yards are on the north edge of the city where the pale stone gives way to packed clay, and the buildings thin out to single-story. Intake blocks with open courtyards and iron frame gates. The clay underfoot is iron-rich. It has a faint orange tint that I noticed automatically, before I could stop myself, the Kropfwerkzeug reflex functioning even then, cataloging soil characteristics at a moment when I could have been doing anything else with my attention. Later, I decided that was a mercy. The brain goes where it can. I arrived on a transit ferry from Koro Station. There were 14 other humans on the ferry, plus a couple of dozen Velathi and 3 or 4 species I hadn't encountered before, each with their own documentation, packets, and their own expressions for whatever they were carrying internally. All of us had been processed through the same Orrathi commercial instrument, some variety of it. All of us had, in some legal sense under the accord, already been filed. The physical transit was just the delivery mechanism. The crossing took 11 hours. The ferry was a working freight hauler, not a passenger ship. Cargo holds converted to dormitory configuration with rows of fold-down bunks and a single shared galley that served hot grain, porridge twice a day, which was better than nothing, and tasted like nothing. The Orrathi, who are small and gray and profoundly good at making themselves invisible when they choose to be, tucked themselves into the upper sleeping berths and stayed there. Their soft bodies turned toward the bulkhead. The humans sat in the lower cabin and mostly stared at their hands or at the middle distance, everyone in their own private calculation of what they were moving toward and what had led to the particular series of decisions and bad luck and other people's choices that had put them on this ferry. I stared at my hands for a while and then stopped because it wasn't helping. I had been, before all of this, a licensed crop surveyor for a mid-range agri-cooperative based out of the Koro system. I knew how to read soil composition tables, how to assess blight patterns from aerial transects, how to file a yield variance report that the insurance underwriters would actually read. I knew the smell of healthy topsoil and the smell of soil that had lost its biology. I knew how to sleep in field tents and how to cook one-pot meals on a portable burner and how to stay warm on a volcanic moon at 2 in the morning when the wind was coming off the thermal vents on your thermal layers were 2 sizes too large, because the cooperative's equipment manager had miscatalogued the inventory again. It was not glamorous work, but it was mine. I had earned the license through 2 years of examinations and one particularly miserable field rotation on a volcanic moon that I will not name because the memory of it still makes my back ache. I had my own small apartment on Koro Station, 3 rooms, and a kitchen with a window that faced the atrium. I had a colleague named Pret who brought pastries to morning briefings without being plain ones, and fruit ones, and one experimental kind with a filling nobody could identify but which everyone agreed was better than the plain. Once I had a cat named 17, gray-green, short-haired, opinionated. My stepfather's name was Orrathi, and I am using his name deliberately because he used mine. He ran a commodities brokerage out of Koro Station, and he had done it badly for 15 years, which is a long time to run anything badly. 15 years is long enough to accumulate the kind of debt that becomes structural, not situational. Debt that has grown into the walls of your life, and that you can no longer address by changing behavior, only by changing what you are willing to offer. He arrived at that point at some time in the previous year. As best I could reconstruct it afterward, he arrived there, looked at his options, and made a decision. The Orrathi trading syndicate called Veshkarat is one of the mid-tier operations, not prominent enough to have a fixed embassy anywhere in Federation space, not large enough to be a political priority for the diplomatic corps, but well-established enough to operate under the loose umbrella of the Orrathi Commercial Accord that the Federation had signed 40 years earlier in a moment of diplomatic optimism that several subsequent administrations had cause to regret. Under the accord, Orrathi commercial filings made in Orrathi-administered territory were recognized as binding contracts, provided both parties had a legal representative present at the time of signing. My stepfather was the first party. I was the second party's representative, which was a legal fiction he had arranged through a notary on Koro Station, whose license I later learned had been purchased, rather than earned, from a broker who ran this particular service out of a storage unit in the Depot District, and who had been operating for 6 years before anyone looked at him carefully. The document my stepfather signed was a debt transfer instrument, his outstanding balance with Veshkarat, discharged in exchange for the delivery of one labor classification candidate, female, age 22, documented professional background, in good health. He told me we were going to Orrathi for a meeting about a possible consulting contract. He mentioned it while I was watering the plants in my apartment. I had a small collection of succulents, which are good plants for a person who travels for work because they are forgiving of absence, and he had the flat, slightly over-casual tone of a person who has rehearsed a sentence until it sounds unrehearsed. I didn't notice. I had no reason to notice. I watered the plants and asked what kind of contract, and he said agricultural assessment, which was a reasonable enough thing for someone to hire his stepdaughter for. And I packed my field kit. I don't spend much time, in the telling, on the ferry, or on the things I thought about during it. or on what happened when we arrived at Varkashet Transit Control, and the documentation was checked and the documentation was correct. Every form accurate, every signature present, purchased notary's seal indistinguishable from a genuine one, in anything less than a forensic audit. What I will say about the transit control arrival is this. The Orrathi who processed the incoming passengers were not different in any measurable way. Immigration agents anywhere else in inhabited space. They had a queue, a desk, a scanner, a tablet. They said the required phrases. They stamped what needed stamping. One of them offered my stepfather a printed information about processing timelines in what I recognized, from his exaggeratedly careful pronunciation, as his third or fourth language. He was being thorough and correct. He was doing his job. The system he worked inside was the thing I was supposed to fear, not him personally, and at no point did he give me any reason to doubt that the system was going to proceed exactly as it was designed to. My stepfather did not look at me during the transit control processing. He was very busy being thorough about his own documentation, which was in a leather effect folder he had purchased for the trip, and which I had never seen before. He held the folder the way a person holds something that justifies what they've done. He looked at the folder. He looked at the Orrathi agent. He looked at the desk. He handed over the debt transfer instrument, along with his other documents when asked, and he did not look at my face when he did it. I looked at his. I want to be precise about what I was looking for. I was looking for something that told me he knew, fully and without the padding of justification, what he was doing. I don't know if I found it. People are remarkably good at not knowing things they have decided not to know. What I saw was a man who was managing a transaction and trying not to think about it as anything other than that. I don't spend time on what his face did when the intake agents asked him to step to the secondary processing check, and he looked at me and I looked back at him for the last time for a long time. The interesting part is not there. The interesting part begins in the intake yard at Varkashet, roughly the third hour past local noon, under that white pressing light. The intake yard is about 200 meters across, open to the sky, with a low wall on 3 sides and a gate on the 4th that leads into the processing block. The floor is that packed orange-tinted clay, smooth from years of foot traffic, warm through my boots, even though the air temperature was only modestly high. There were perhaps 60 people in the yard when our ferry group was walked in, already processed, already waiting, arranged in loose clusters near the far wall, where a canopy of treated fabric provided a strip of shade from the overhead light. They were quiet. Not the quiet of people who have been told to be quiet, but the quiet of people who have completed one stage of something and don't yet know what the next stage will be, and who have found that talking doesn't help with that kind of waiting. The Orrathi intake workers, 4 of them, in gray tunics with the Veshkarat caste mark on the left shoulder, a double-stroke glyph that I would learn later meant 3rd-tier commercial, one of 7-tier designations, moved through the new arrivals with scanners and a portable stamp press. The process was quick. They had clearly done it many times. There was no wasted motion. They scanned your documentation, confirmed it against their register with a sweep of the tablet, asked you 4 questions through a small translation unit clipped to their tunics. Current health status, your primary skill classifications, your linguistic range, and whether you had any active kinship claims in the Federation registry that had not been disclosed in the filing documentation. The questions were asked in a neutral tone, and the answers were recorded, and nothing changed in the intake worker's expression regardless of what you said. Then the stamp press came out. It was about the size of a thick book, handheld, warm to the touch from being in use. The thermal block pressed against the slip for 2 seconds with a sound like a soft click. The glyph came up black against the beige, and then the intake worker peeled the backing. A thin strip of protective paper she folded once and tucked into a pocket, and pressed the slip to the inside of your left forearm, just below the elbow, with 2 fingers, holding it flat for a moment while the adhesive took. I watched 3 people ahead of me receive theirs. A man about my age who had the calloused hands of someone who worked with machinery, a woman older than me, who looked at the slip after it was placed and then looked away, at the far wall, at nothing in particular. A Orrathi who stood very still during the process and continued standing very still after it, one hand touching the other forearm lightly, over the sleeve. Then it was my turn. The adhesive was stronger than it looked. The stamp press had applied the slip at an angle slightly different from what I had expected. And I tried, without thinking, peel the edge up with my thumbnail to reposition it. The intake worker, a woman with the flat brow ridges of middle-aged Orrathi, said something without looking at me. "She says don't," said the person beside me. It was the Orrathi man from the ferry, the one who had been in the upper berth, who had apparently come through processing slightly ahead of me. He spoke passable standard, accented with the rounded vowels of the outer Orrathi trade tongue. "She says it's sealed now. It's part of the processing record." I looked at the slip. The glyph meant nothing to me. 6 black strokes on waxy beige paper smaller than my thumb. "What does it say?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Kensha. It is a classification. Household service workers. People who work in domestic service in a private household. Under the accord. Under the accord, yes." I stood in the intake yard for the next 3 hours. The sun moved. The shadows under the canopy shifted and lengthened slightly, which was the only visible measure of time passing. A water cart came around at some point, and the intake workers distributed small cups without speaking, moving through the yard with the easy routine of people performing a task that requires no decision-making. The water tasted faintly of the resin and oil smell I had been too frightened to register when the slip was applied, which I noticed only when I finished the cup and handed it back. It was not unpleasant, it was just information. Around me, people talked or didn't talk, sat down on the clay floor or stood. The Orrathi workers completed their processing and went inside and came out again, carrying folders or tablets, moving with the purposeful lateral lean I was already learning to read as their default working posture. The 60 people who had been in the yard when we unarrived were moved in small groups through a door in the far wall, called out by number from a list the senior agent read from her tablet. Each group went quietly. Nobody made anything of it. This was the most unsettling thing. That there was nothing to resist, because there was nothing being directed at you personally. You were a record. Words were processed. Our group was not moved. We were, I would understand much later, in a secondary staging phase, held pending placement confirmation from the Veshkarat receiving office on Var Keshet's commercial row, a few blocks south. The confirmation process involved a secondary review of the incoming documentation by a different set of clerks who checked the filing against the syndicate's current placement inventory, available households, current contracts, the list of clients whose Kensha applications had been approved and who were waiting for matched personnel. It was, by Orrathi administrative standards, a relatively quick process. By any other measure, it was 3 hours of standing in a clay yard under a white sun, with a waxy slip on your forearm. I counted things. I counted the cracks in the clay floor, where the packing had dried and separated into rough, irregular tiles, most of them smaller than my hand. I counted the Orrathi cast mark glyphs on the processing block wall, the ones carved into the stone above the gate, and painted in the dark red they used for administrative markings. I counted the number of people in my ferry group who were sitting versus standing at any given point, and the way that number changed as the afternoon advanced. I counted these things not because the counting mattered, but because it held a narrow channel of my attention, occupied and kept the rest from running somewhere I couldn't afford to go yet. I stood and I waited and I looked at the slip on my forearm, and I thought about my apartment, about Pret and the pastries. About 17. The cat who was at that moment probably engaged in her ongoing campaign against the kitchen cabinet door. She had been trying to open it for 2 years. She had never succeeded. She had not accepted this, and I made myself breathe steadily and count things the way I had taught myself to count them years before when I needed my brain to stay in one place. Other people. Clay tiles in the floor, where the packing had cracked into rough rectangles. The number of Orrathi glyphs visible on the processing block wall above the gate, carved into the stone and painted in the dark red they used for administrative marks, was on count 87 when the gate opened and the Federation liaison officer walked in, I didn't know who he was at first. I knew the jacket. The gray-green field coat with the Federation crest on the left breast that you see on trade attaches, diplomatic staff, anyone doing official business in contested territory under the Accord. I had seen those jackets on Koro Station occasionally, usually on people who were about to brief our cooperative on some new interstellar commodities regulation that would require 3 months of adjusted methodology. They were not, as a rule, the kind of people you associated with intake yards. They were people you associated with conference rooms and registration desks. And the particular brand of patient professional exhaustion that comes spending your career navigating the gap between what agreements say and what they do. This one was maybe 45, built like someone who had spent real time in the field before the desk work found him. Not tall, but there was a solidity to the way he moved, an economy of motion, the kind you develop when you have spent long stretches in environments where wasted movement costs something real. His hair was going gray at the temples, and he had not done anything to arrest that. He had the unhurried bearing of a man who had seen a lot of yards like this one, and had decided, some years ago, to stop being surprised by them and start being useful in them instead. He walked directly to the processing desk and spoke to the senior intake agent in Orrathi. He spoke it fluently in the way that distinguishes people who learned a language from people who learned it and then used it in real situations for a long time. The accented edges worn down to something workable, the pauses in the right places, the confidence of a person who knows that if they say the wrong word, they will know it from the response and can adjust. The senior agent pulled up a tablet and scrolled through it. Marsh watched the screen. He pointed at something. The agent scrolled back, looked at the same entry again, then pulled out a second tablet and compared the two displays. I was about 40 meters from the desk. The yard was quiet enough that I could hear the general shape of the exchange without making out the individual words. The agent said something in Orrathi that had the rising cadence of a question. Marsh answered with 2 sentences that had the cadence of a clarification followed by a reference, the kind of phrasing you use when you are citing specific provision. The agent turned to her colleague, the younger woman who had placed my slip, and said something. The younger worker pulled out the portable stamp press and carried it to the desk. More comparison of tablets. Then the senior agent went inside the processing block through a side door and came back 2 minutes later carrying a physical folder. Actual documentation, pages and cover sheet, the kind the Orrathi still used for formal filings, because their commercial accord had been drafted in era before electronic records, and the relevant statutes had never been amended to accept them. Marsh took the folder. He opened it, read the first page, with the steady attention of someone reading a legal instrument and making sure they understand exactly what it says before they say anything about it. He turned to the second page, read that with the same attention. He closed the folder, not with any drama, just closed it, stood for a moment in the particular way that people stand when a decision has been reached, and they are simply completing the motion of arriving at it. Then he walked into the yard. He worked through the people with Federation crest registration mark in their documentation. This was, I would learn later, the official purpose of his visit, a routine quarterly audit of Federation-affiliated individuals in Orrathi classification, processing, a function specified in the Accord's administrative appendices, and which the Orrathi honored because the appendices said they had to, and because in 11 years nothing had ever come of it. He moved efficiently, checking documentation, speaking briefly in standard or Velothi trade tongue or Orrathi as required, making notes on a small handheld log. He reached me. He looked at the slip on my forearm. Then he looked at my face. He held out his hand for my documentation, and I gave it to him from the field kit. My surveyor's license, my transit papers, the full packet, the habit of a person who keeps their identity documents organized and accessible, because fieldwork teaches you that you will need them at inconvenient moments. He read through the transit papers with the same steady attention he had given the folder. He found the debt transfer instrument, the document my stepfather's purchased notary had filed, and read it twice. He turned back to the first page and read a paragraph near the bottom again more slowly. Olar, he said. Seti, Olari. Yes. Crop surveyor, licensed, Koro Cooperative Registry. Yes. Do you speak Orrathi? No. Any Orrathi at all? Numbers? Counting? I almost said no again. The automatic no of someone who doesn't speak Orrathi, which was true. Then I remembered Kethfarain. When I was 7 years old, there was an Orrathi man by that name who worked for 3 months as a cargo supervisor at the Koro Station Freight Depot, and who had, for reasons I never fully understood, made a project of teaching the children of depot workers the Orrathi number counting sequence as a kind of game. Orrathi numbers up to 20 follow a scale pattern. Each number has a tonal contour, rising and falling in a sequence that approximates a musical scale, and which is genuinely easy to memorize if you're young enough that your brain is still in the phase of treating everything as music. I had sat on a cargo crate on 3 consecutive afternoons and learned to count to 20 in Orrathi, and the way a child's brain holds things it learns before it has context for them, I had never lost it. It had sat in memory for 15 years, undisturbed, available. I can count to 20, I said, in Orrathi, from when I was a child. Cargo supervisor taught me. Something shifted in his expression. A small movement at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same vicinity. Can you count to 9?
Yes.
Good, he said. He handed my documentation back. He walked to the processing desk, opened the physical folder, and spoke to the senior agent at some length. The agent listened. Her expression had been professionally neutral expression of an Orrathi administrative worker conducting a standard intake procedure, shifted into something I didn't have a word for yet. I would learn later that it was a specific Orrathi facial configuration called Veth-Korath, translates approximately as the irritation of being caught following your own rules correctly. It involves a flattening of the brow ridges and a tightening at the corners of the jaw. It's the expression of a person who has just understood that the procedure they have been following will produce outcome they least want while remaining entirely within the procedure. I have seen it many times since. I have never stopped finding it satisfying. The agent spoke at some length, with what I read as an attempt at authority. Marsh waited for her to finish, then said 5 words in Orrathi, quietly, in a tone that was not aggressive and not raised, just final, the way a door closing is final. Not a declaration, a fact delivered. The agent looked at her colleague. Her colleague looked at the folder. Neither of them said anything. Marsh came back across the yard to where I was standing. He opened the folder. He removed my debt transfer instrument, placed the rest of the folder under his arm, and held the document with both hands. He folded it lengthwise along its center crease, holding the fold clean and firm. Then he tore it in half. One motion, one clean sound. He set the folder on the ground, evened up the 2 halves, folded them together, and pressed them into my palm. That one's yours now, he said. I stood there with the 2 halves of the paper in my hand, careful and honest about what I felt in that moment. Because the story is not worth telling if I am not honest about it. I felt nothing, first. Not relief, not gratitude, not the collapse of tension I had been carrying for 3 days and 11 hours of ferry transit and 3 hours of standing in an intake yard under a pressing white sun. Nothing. The brain sometimes takes a moment to understand when a catastrophic pressure has been removed, because it has been spending every resource it has adjusting to the weight, and it needs a moment to understand the absence. I stood and I breathed. Marsh was already turning back to the processing desk to retrieve the folder. Wait, I said. What just happened? What did you say to them? He paused, turned back slightly. Orrathi Commercial Accord, Statute 7, Kensha Vorath subsection. A Kensha classification is legally binding only as long as the originating filing document exists in its original unmodified form. The statute was written when they were using clay tablets, because a clay tablet impression can't be repressed without destroying it. The paper era never changed it. You tear the document, the filing dissolves. It has been that way for 600 years. You knew that before you came in here. I knew it before I came to this moon. I looked at the slip still on my forearm, then at the 2 halves of paper in my hand. And they accept that. They don't like it, he said, but they follow their statutes. They always have. It's the thing about the Orrathi that most people don't understand. They're not lawless. They're operating under a different system of law. You learn their law carefully enough, you can work inside it. Sometimes that works out in your favor. I turned this over. My stepfather filed that document. He had authorization. He had authorization from a notary whose license was purchased. I'll be filing a separate complaint about that on the return transit. That process will take longer than tearing a piece of paper, but it will conclude the same way. He said it without satisfaction, without theater. A trajectory stated. A thing that was going to happen. Describes in the same tone you use to describe weather. Put the two halves of paper into my field kit, in the front pouch beside my surveyor's license. Then, I stood in the intake yard and breathed some more. And gradually the nothing became something, and the something was a low steady trembling that I could feel in my hands and my chest. Not grief, and not joy, but the body's registered form of being returned to itself after it had understood that it was no longer going to be. We walked out of the intake yard together, through the gate, and into the clay streets of Varkeshet's North District. The noon light hit us, and I blinked against it. A real blink this time. The involuntary response of eyes that were finally allowed to be normal about ness. The Orrathi city spread ahead, low and white and purposeful, its streets busy with that lateral redirecting movement that looks, when you first see it, like something between a river and a market floor. You asked me if I could count to 9, I said. Your stepfather's documentation listed your professional qualifications. Crop surveyor, licensed, 3 years active, 2 field rotations including 1 in high volatility soil chemistry. At a pace that expected me to keep up with, which I did. The Kensha classification has subcategories. One of them is for workers with technical or professional expertise, which they call Ometh-3. The highest subcategory is Omega-9. Your stepfather probably didn't know that. Filing agent at his end likely just checked the box for documented professional qualifications and let the system assign the subcategory automatically. He glanced over. Omega-9 Kensha are not processed through the standard intake yard. They're held in a separate facility, pending placement with premium clients. The security on that facility is different. I let this settle. If they'd realized before they stamped the slip, you would have been in a different building before I arrived. Quarterly audit doesn't cover that facility. So the ordinary slip was a lucky administrative error, from your perspective. I thought about this for most of a block. And you saw the subcategory in the documentation. I saw it from the folder at the desk. That's when I knew the standard yard could still complete the process. You moved quickly. He didn't say anything to that. Thank you, I said. The words were inadequate in the way that the right words usually are. He shook his head. Once. Not dismissively, but in the manner of someone who does not know how to receive gratitude cleanly and would rather be moving. I have been filing those quarterly audits for 11 years, he said. Before today, they were mostly paperwork. I have turned that sentence over many times since. There is more truth in it than in any version where he would have said something about duty or principle. 11 years of quarterly audits that were mostly paperwork. And then one Tuesday, one that wasn't. I stayed on Orrathi for 4 more days, while Marsh filed the formal complaint about the notary and arranged my passage back to Koro Station on a Federation supply run. He had a small office in the diplomatic block on the south side of Varkeshet. 2 rooms with actual windows that let in the afternoon light, which was unusual in the city, because the Orrathi don't regard natural light as functionally relevant to work in their architecture. Flex this. He gave me the use of the outer room and its chair and its supply cabinet which held tea, Koro Station blend, the dark-pressed kind in the flat tins, and a small collection of commercial reference texts, including a complete printed edition of the commercial, Accord in both Standard and Orrathi. I started reading the Accord on the second afternoon. I'm not sure what the impulse was precisely. Something between needing to understand the thing that had been used against me and needing more basically to have something to do with my hands that would keep my mind in one place. I read slowly, with the same attention I gave yield variance reports, noting the structure, following the cross-references, making small marks in the margins with a pencil from the supply cabinet. It is a meticulous document. It covers thousands of categories of commercial relationship, each described with the precision of something designed to function without oversight or appeal. A system that assumes all parties are operating in faith within Orrathi commercial norms, and that therefore builds its enforcement mechanism into the language of the statutes themselves, rather than into external institutions. The clauses are not written to prevent bad behavior. They are written to define behavior so precisely that it cannot be misclaimed. This distinction, I came to understand as I read, is the whole architecture of how the Orrathi think about agreements. They do not ask whether something is ethical. They ask whether it fits the filed category. If it fits, it proceeds. If it doesn't fit, if the document has been torn, if the notary's license was purchased, if the subs category was assigned without verification, then the procedure reverses, cleanly and without appeal, because the procedure is the law, and the law has been followed. The Kensha statutes run to 43 pages. Kensha Vorath, the subsection about the original filing documents requirement for existence, is 3 sentences. 3 sentences in 43 pages, carried forward unrevised from the clay tablet period, because there had never been a reason to change them. On the 3rd afternoon, Marsh came back from a meeting at the Orrathi Commercial Registry and found me at the far end of the Accord's appendices. He sat down at the desk in the inner room and looked at me across the doorway. "You're a surveyor," he said. "Was," I said. Old reflex. "Still are," he said. "The filing is dissolved. Your federation license is unaffected. Your cooperative registration is unaffected. The classification that was placed on you has no legal standing and left no record in the Federation Registry." He paused. "The notary's fraudulent license does leave a record. In your stepfather's." I thought about that for a moment. "He filed the debt transfer using my name as the instrument, identity fraud. Yes. Complaint would go to the Federation's civil registry, and, from there, to the Accord dispute mechanism. Under the Accord's liability transfer provisions, an invalid discharge returns the original debt to the original debtor. 30% penalty surcharge." He set a folder on the edge of the desk. "The forms are there if you want them. It's your decision." I picked up the folder and looked at the forms inside. Standard format complaint documentation, the kind with numbered seconds, and checkbox fields, and a signature block at the bottom, with a space for a witness's countersignature. Clear and precise, each field doing one thing. "I'll need your countersignature," I said. "I know," he said, and went back to his work. I filled out the forms that evening. I took my time with them. I checked each section twice, and looked up the correct statute references in the Accord for the 3 citations that the forms required, using the index in the back of the printed edition, and I wrote the citations out carefully in the appropriate boxes. The work of it was quieting, in the way that precise work is quieting. It requires just enough attention to keep the rest of your thoughts from interfering without requiring so much that you can't sustain it. I finished, read through the completed forms once more, them in the folder with the supporting documents and my own signature on the signature block. I slid the folder under the inner room door. We left on the 5th day on a Federation supply transport whose crew were the particular kind of professional competent that asks no questions about Federation passengers and provides clean bunks and a working galley without requiring conversation. I had a porthole in my bunk compartment that showed for the first 8 hours of the transit the limb of Orrath's primary hanging in the dark of transit space. Furathsal, unnamed by the Orrathi, enormous and pale and indifferent, throwing the flames in all directions. The same light that had pressed down on the intake yard, now rendered at this distance into something almost peaceful. At some point during the transit, somewhere between the 6th and 7th hour, I took the 2 halves of the paper out of my field kit and moved them to the needle tin. I don't remember deciding to. I remember holding them, the paper slightly soft already from being in the document pouch, and reaching for the tin and pressing the 2 pieces flat inside it and closing the lid with a small, clean click. The tin fitted into the upper left pocket of my field jacket precisely as if it had always been the right size for it. The Kensha slip on my forearm lasted 12 days rather than the 2 weeks Marsh had estimated. Peeled the last of it off in my apartment bathroom on Koro Station. My apartment, the building's property service had maintained in my absence, the plant watered, the mail collected, 17 the cat returned from the neighbor who'd been keeping her, and aggrieved in the specific feline way that forgives completely while refusing to acknowledge that forgiveness has occurred, demanding breakfast, and then sitting with her back to me for 20 minutes before finally condescending to curl on my feet while I sat on the kitchen floor. I went back to work on the Monday. Cooperative took me back without ceremony or explanation required. My license still current, the season's fieldwork backlogged and needing hands. Brought pastries. I said I'd been dealing with a family matter, and Pritt nodded once. In the way of someone who understands that some family matters are not for morning briefings, and offered me the fruit ones first. The first week back was strange, in the particular way that returning to ordinary work is strange after something that was not ordinary. The yield variance reports were exactly as they had always been. The soil composition tables read the same way. The cooperative's equipment manager had again miscatalogued the inventory, and the thermal layers for the upcoming volcanic moon rotation were, again, 2 sizes too large. I corrected the inventory, filed the correction, and spent 45 minutes feeling the specific satisfaction of a thing put right that should not have been wrong. It was small. It was mine. I told Pritt everything, months later, when the civil complaint had been decided, and the outcome confirmed in writing. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Is there anything you need?" And I said no, and she said, "All right." And she put another pastry in front of me, and that was the end of it. The outcome of the civil complaint was confirmed 14 months after I filed it. Orrathi found liable under the accord for the original Vesh-Karat debt, plus the 30% penalty surcharge under the liability transfer provision, plus Federation's civil costs for the fraudulent notary complaint. I received a 2-paragraph letter from the Accord Dispute Registry, formal language, no commentary. I read it once, put it in the drawer where I keep documents I've finished with but haven't decided to discard, and went back to the variance report I had been working on. I did not arrange that outcome. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for the kind of story this is. I filed the forms correctly, completely, with accurate citations, because that is what you do with forms. The outcome followed from the forms and the statutes and the established liability provisions of a 600-year-old commercial accord. I did not cause it. The system caused it. The same system that had filed me as a line in a ledger turned around, when applied correctly, and applied the same precision to my stepfather that it had applied to me. I found this satisfying in a way that I still find difficult to fully describe, but which has something to do with the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge is personal and effortful and leaves a residue. This was just the accord doing what the accord does, following the procedure all the way through. There are 63 clauses in the commercial accord that function the way Kensha, Orrathi functions. Provisions carried forward from an earlier technological era that the Orrathi have never revised, because the Orrathi revise what needs revision, and they have never needed to revise these. Because I read the entire accord over the 3 years following my return to Koro Station. Not because I was asked to, not because it was professionally relevant to crop survey work. It isn't, or wasn't then, but because I wanted to know the terrain. Surveyors map terrain before they move through it. This was a kind of terrain. I mean, when I say the tool was there the whole time, is this. The clause didn't change, the statute didn't move, the Orrathi didn't revise it, and the Accord's administrative bodies didn't flag it, and 600 years of commercial activity proceeded without anyone needing to tear a document and dissolve a filing. The tool existed in the complete and undisturbed way that tools exist when they are not being used, sitting exactly where they were left, ready. What changed was one person who had spent 11 years reading the maintenance manual, carefully enough to know where it was. Marsh is still working. I know because he sent me a message 2 years ago, brief and professional, about a case developing in one of the mid-tier Orrathi jurisdictions that was going to require a specific element. A count to 9 in Orrathi, spoken aloud, by someone with a Federation-registered license in a technical field, in the presence of 2 Orrathi witnesses. He wanted to know if I still had the sequence. I wrote back the same evening. I typed out the count from 1 to 9, phonetically rendered. It's the scale pattern, rising and falling, the way Kethvarain had taught it on the cargo crates at Koro Station Depot, Scent certainly still terrible, the sequence intact and available, and exactly as I had learned it at the age of 7 before I had any idea what it might one day be for. He wrote back one word, good. I still have the tin.